In the last week, reports have begun to emerge that Nintendo may be seeking to enter the Indian market. Now, in this video, I want to explore when this is likely to happen, what the consequences might be, what the upsides and the downsides are for Nintendo, what are the risks, and what are the potential rewards. So, let's start with the original report, which started all of this. And this was from a podcast from games analyst Rishi Alwani, who, as it says here, highlighted the Nintendo Switch is reportedly planning to launch in India in early 2027, around February or March, at a price point of roughly 20,000 rupees, which is roughly $200. He further noted that it will be most likely the non-OLED version of the console, and that the report is not about the Switch 2. Now, it would make sense to have either the Switch Lite or the original Nintendo Switch being used in these markets. These systems have the biggest margins for Nintendo compared to the OLED, and obviously particularly compared to the Switch 2. This means that they can afford to offer a discount appropriate to this market, and therefore hopefully still make some level of profit while expanding into a different territory. It's also a good opportunity to do so for various reasons that we will get into. But let's first of all get a sense of what the online and gaming space is like for the Indian market. Now, there were some teething issues with other companies trying to enter the Indian games market, particularly with the rollout of Wi-Fi 7, which still isn't in many homes, but is something which is now available, and that was a bit of an issue for Sony in terms of their recent game rollouts. But you can see that out of the huge Indian population, they've got a population of about 1.5 billion people. Well, you can see that around 488 million, so what's that, roughly a third, are playing games of some sort. Now, that's still not that many when you consider the huge scale of India, but it's got a broadly younger population, and you can see that there's still quite a good value in the games market. It says the games market was valued at 3.7 billion US dollars in 2024 and is expected to reach 9.1 billion by 2029. Therefore, there is a huge growth potential in here with lots of people playing, and of course, there is quite a range of different types of games that are being played. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that all of these are particularly suited to Nintendo, and we'll have a look at the kinds of things that people might be playing in general in a second. But I think we also need to look at how other companies have dealt with the issue of breaking into India. So we can compare with the approach of Apple. So Apple, it says, have repeatedly pointed to India as a standout market in recent quarters, with CEO Tim Cook saying the company set an all-time revenue record in India. Now, obviously that's from a low base, and Apple has particularly tried to cultivate its relationships with India, including, it must be said, through their development side of things. But I can see here that this is the beginnings of what they might hope to be a long-term relationship, and I think Nintendo, while earlier in the process, will also be thinking at this point of starting the process of cultivating a broad user base in India, rather than necessarily seeing this as a big and major push in its own right now. Now, Sony has got a little bit ahead of the curve with this. It seems that there is a quite significant uptake of Sony PlayStation in India, at least proportionate to the overall video game console market. So it seems this was a report from a couple of years ago, and at that time, Sony had about 350,000 PlayStation 4s there, and they thought that PlayStation 5 had an install base of around 300,000 units. However, and this is a key part, these figures were both grey and official sales combined. And of course, the grey market, the illegal market, is a particularly significant problem for Nintendo because they do not have an official presence there. And of course, many people can't afford the costs of these machines. Therefore, it ends up being something that is, if not completely black market, then at least these are systems which have been bought and adapted and are used in different ways, something that Nintendo is very keen to avoid. However, you can see that there are some significant possibilities here to expand. Yes, it's true that the wages in India are significantly lower than in other parts of the world. Here we can see that we've got an idea of different wages at different levels across different industries. And these are, for rough comparisons, let's say 20,000 US dollars. So you can see 20 to 40,000 US dollars is a senior, so 8+ years income for IT and software. Well, that's actually not too bad, but of course it does go down considerably, and you can see that overall most people in India are not going to be making the kind of money that will allow them to purchase a high-priced console like the ones that Nintendo produces, even their lower tier consoles. Now, on the other hand, the cost of living will be lower in other respects, so it's not quite so drastic, but it still means that Nintendo is going to have to really reconsider what it thinks of as good margins when it enters this space. And here we can see some other ways that people have come into difficulty. So this is also from Sony, and what they said is that they found that because it's a multilingual society, they have had problems. In their case, they are looking into research using AI technology, machine learning, to shorten dubbing and translation processes. It's true, of course, that 48% of the country does speak Hindi, so there is a very significant, that's 750 odd million people. So that's a quite significant number of people who they can still reach, and those people do speak Hindi, but there's still a mild majority of the population who speak a huge range of different languages, and so obviously that creates other kinds of frictions there. It's also true that many people are bilingual, and so they obviously have English speaking content, but that also creates risks for the grey market as well. It would be better for Nintendo if they could localize things to many, many different languages, but of course the cost attendant on that might be more than the actual revenue they could stand to make. Now, how big a problem is the grey market jailbreaking of content in the Indian market? So here we've got an article which goes into the problem of jailbreaking, sideloading, and regional pricing exploits, and it says these have become common practices. Now, of course, the problem is the longer that Nintendo has this problem where they are not actually in the market themselves, the easier it is for people to justify the idea of accessing Nintendo content using these methods, because there literally is no other way around. There would be no legal approach, and so it becomes more and more accessible to more and more people to access the grey market. And this person says, I see daily requests to mod devices. It's not because people want to cheat the system. They simply cannot afford a new game every month at global prices, and if companies reduced prices or offered strong local discounts, piracy would drop overnight. Well, that's his speculation. It's not necessarily the case, because I think there are other issues as well, but fundamentally Nintendo isn't even in the market, so even if the prices were lower, and it's pretty difficult to get lower than free, I think they would still need to find some way to actually appeal to people and get people to purchase at prices which are appropriate. That's always going to be difficult with older games, but with games that have been around the block a bit, like some of the ones on Nintendo Switch, they may feel that they have more flexibility. It also is interesting in this article that it mentions the release of Steam Deck and the Steam Deck OLED slowing down the Switch sales in recent years, because people are seeing the Steam Deck as something that can be used as a portable PC, a cheap way to access a PC market and to then crack it and customize the software environment. And that's obviously something which is going to be a bit of an issue for Nintendo Switch, but actually Nintendo won't be too concerned about it, because they don't want people to be using the Switch in this way. They want something which is going to be accessible to all consumers early on. Now, one other limitation that Nintendo might have is cultural issues. Anytime you enter a new market, you have the risk that people will not quite understand what you're doing, or you might step on cultural toes without knowing it. This was rather comedically identified in 2016 when Pokemon Go was not even officially released in India, but it reached court because it hurt the religious sentiment of vegetarians, because some of the Pokemon centers were put in places of religious significance. Now, to be fair, even the people at the time were highlighting that this was an example of frivolity, and the former minister Shashi Tharoor tweeted, to file in the only in India category would be funny if such frivolous cases didn't clog up our judicial system. So this isn't something which is going to be a major concern, but it is something that is worth considering for Nintendo. We also need to think about how the distribution will work, and here they seem to have a pretty good partner. So the Reddington Group in India have actually handled distribution for a number of other companies over the years, and we can see from Epson, Trip and Samsung to Compaq and Philips, and then Intel, Microsoft, and of course Apple. I think Nintendo are in very good hands in their partnership with Reddington. They're not going outside the usual bounds of what is going to be normal in this territory, and they will be hoping that they can have similar results that Apple have had. Not necessarily stratospheric on day one, but perhaps with a strong long-term potential. Now, How long has Nintendo actually been eyeing up the Indian market? Well, it was interesting to go back to the 2008 reports that Satoru Iwata filed when he had the Q&As with the investors back then. And there was a question that was asked of him, this is nearly 20 years ago, about the potential of the market in other parts of the world. So this person said, I would like to know about the current market situations, your perspective on such countries with large populations of South Korea, China, Southeast Asian countries, India, and Russia. Now, it's interesting actually because many of these have become successful, or at least Nintendo have turned away from them deliberately over the years. So South Korea has been quite a big focus, and we saw on Nintendo's recent investor report that the other section, that's not Europe, not North America, not Japan, but the other sections of the world, has actually been one of the more significant growth areas. And of course, South Korea accounts for a good amount of that. They are also entering the South Asian countries, particularly Singapore. China has been a bit of a mixed bag, really, and I do have a separate video which looks into China. And of course, they have had to pull out of Russia due to the Ukraine war. That was something that happened a little bit earlier this decade. But at any rate, Iwata mentioned then, look, the ultimate market size can be determined by the total population in the market, and in the midterm, I think countries with large populations have significant potential. Now, at that point, they were trying to launch the Wii, and they realized that allocating resources into the European and American market was a bigger priority, so they didn't actually decide to pursue the Indian market or any of these other large markets as they once intended. However, they did intend in the long term to try to push into those markets, and of course in the fullness of time they did. And he was saying that countries with large populations from a middle term perspective have significant market potential for DS, Wii and any future projects, so we would like to tackle them as a mid-term issue, and that's kind of what they've done. So a few years later, it was the case that they asked another question, and Iwata said, if you look at the global population, Japan's population is declining, and Europe and the US are increasing, but not as much as Asia. In addition, Asia has higher economic growth, and considering that consumers categorized as middle class and above, or the people who have enough food and clothing, desire entertainment to enrich their lives, and the number of such consumers will be increasing on large scale, I think it is necessary to expand our business in Asia. On the other hand, regarding conducting business in Asia, there are many discussions about whether what we have done in Japan, US, or Europe will really work in this market, or as you point out, to what degree consumers will accept our products in the current copy heaven environment, i.e., a very large grey market environment. Therefore, that gives us more reasons to localize the local language, understand the local culture, and recognize what things the local people value and will pay money for. And I think all of this is really key to consider. The problem is Nintendo has in India a very large number of local languages, albeit, as I've said, with one very significant one in Hindi. The local culture, they've already had a couple of issues with, but generally speaking, should be receptive. And of course, they want to understand what people see of as value and what they will pay money for, and because of the strong grey market, that has been an issue. If it is simply a case of competing to be the cheapest, well, Nintendo can be relatively cheap in the context of the US and the European market and even the Japanese market, because they're competing significantly in the video game space with people like Sony and Microsoft, the high-end competitors. But in the context of being able to basically pirate content that is there because there is no significant established market, well, in that case, I'm not sure Nintendo is going to be coming off as a particularly low price, and so they need to offer some value, some reason to actually purchase from Nintendo and to build up that customer relationship. Now, they're saying here, this is Iwata from back in 2011. If we were selling daily necessities, it would be acceptable to make and provide cheaper and better things, but that is not the case for entertainment, and we would like to show our results after we research what entertainment local people will really enjoy. We are proceeding with investment, organising teams and product plans to develop businesses in Asia, since I think this will be one of the most important fields in the next few years, and I believe I will be able to explain more about it in places such as business reports when we have specific details. Now, of course, that didn't really emerge because the Wii U obviously went the way of the Wii U, and of course Satoru Iwata sadly died. It's not something that Nintendo has significantly talked about in recent years, but you can see that they have had some success expanding, particularly into Singapore, To some degree, they had a limited bounce in China before that went south, and in the future, we're going to see a lot more, I think, one way or the other, of the Indian market, but it's still pretty early days. Let's just pivot a second to consider why this is a good time for Nintendo to be starting to move into this market. And of course, we've just had the release of the Super Mario Galaxy movie. Now, here we can see that the total intake for some of the January to April films from the Indian domestic box office are given here, and you can see that Durandar the Revenge has earned 1,275 crore rupees, which is about 120, 130 million US dollars. Now, you might think, well, so what? Well, let's use this as a comparison point. So let's compare this with the Super Mario Galaxy movie. And here we can see that the original film had this amount, but the amount that was taken in India was a very small portion of that. So that's 0.21%. This 7.88 rupees crore net is equivalent to something in the region of maybe $8 million, which is not that significant an amount. And so you can see that although the films have released in India, it's not a major market for them. However, as I keep saying, it is a massive, massive market, and there are other reasons to imagine that this amount of people being interested could grow over time. India has a huge expat population, including many people in the Western countries where Nintendo is more established, and there's a lot more cultural exchange than ever before due to rapid communication. So you'd imagine things like Nintendo content becoming more high profile in the minds of the Indian population, particularly the young Indian population. And although this is a relatively small drop in the bucket compared to their overall revenue, it is something where they have at least put some effort into promoting themselves in India, and so now would seem like a good chance to press that advantage with the portion of people who are interested in the console and in the games that come along with it. And we can see that other developers have taken a similar approach in terms of cracking India, and in fact Sony have gone a little bit further. It says here, meanwhile in May 2023, Sony Interactive Entertainment began its India Hero Project, an incubator program for game developers to identify and support game development talent in the region. Going forward, Sony intends to continue investing its management resources in India to expand the creation of locally rooted content. Now, I don't necessarily think that this will be something that will be as big a concern for Nintendo as it is for Sony. Sony, of course, has a quite different situation because they are incredibly diversified, including in television and audio and all sorts of other fields. They can afford to ameliorate their costs of trying to enter a market across all of those different kinds of projects, and also they stand to benefit a lot more. They have television projects and all sorts of other things that they would like to push, and so it's not immediately as concerning for them if they have a bit of a dud in terms of developing some new Indian content, if ultimately it builds relationships in the region with the creative individuals there, and it allows them to have a greater purchase in the market in years to come. For Nintendo, I don't think they are going to be particularly looking to develop into the Indian creative space anytime soon. They don't have that many international groups that they work with, although of course they do now have people in Canada, Singapore, Australia, and a few other places that they work with. There's Forever Entertainment in Poland, and they do subcontract out to quite a few different places. So for example, CGBot in Mexico, or at least partially in Mexico, supported very heavily with Metroid Prime Remastered. It is something that they may consider in the future, but I don't think this is probably where they're going just yet. Sony, it seems, are a little bit ahead of them in this regard, and probably will remain a bit ahead of them for the time being. All that said, you can imagine that there are places that Nintendo could do quite well in India. Because of the larger uptake of phones, then they already have things like Mario Run, and you could imagine things like Pictonico, which I believe will release in India, being quite a successful thing, potentially, at least, because of the ability for people to play around on a fairly low stakes basis with Nintendo content. But as to whether this will be a major success for Nintendo right now, it's a little bit more ambiguous. I think ultimately they know that this is something they can afford to do with really very little negative cost to them. they are going to have at certain points a significant amount of stock on hand of Nintendo content, and so they can decide to try their luck with different markets. And I think that's what they're doing here. Effectively, if they couldn't sell these products, or if they were going to have to warehouse them for long periods, then the cost would be written off. So they might as well try something different with them. And I think entering the Indian market with an older console at this point does make some sense. Now, having said that, it does mean that they perhaps aren't looking, as it might have seemed, to use the Switch in the American and European markets, and whether or not they're trying to create more original Nintendo Switches seems rather dubious. They went down to 4 million sold last year, and on the kinds of trends that we saw towards the end of the DS and 3DS's life, you're probably looking at maybe 1 million sold next year. So we are very much on the downward trend for the Nintendo Switch. For those people who are watching to see if it's going to eclipse the very vague Sony PlayStation 2 number of around 160 million, I don't think it will ever be decisively proven, because I don't think it's in Sony's interests to ever say for absolute sure what that number is, and it seems pretty unlikely to me that Nintendo will be able to shift multiple millions of copies in India, at least in the medium term. All that said, it will be a new market for them. It will be a chance to raise their profile, and I think it will be very interesting to see how this does, and whether there are further updates from Shuntaro Furukawa in future investor reports. This may be the beginning of something that is much more significant in the years and decades ahead, but for now, it's just quite an interesting insight into the way Nintendo are utilizing their stock of the existing system. This also, to me, kind of indicates that they are ready to move to some kind of Switch 2 light model, since moving away from the Switch, which is currently their lower cost option, would be a prerequisite to introducing some kind of new budget possibility. Now, having said that, how budget the Switch 2 can be, given all the costs associated with it and the memory price increases and such like, well, that's something that I might come to in a different video. For now, I'm just going to say thank you so much for watching. Please do consider checking out the Patreon for early, ad-free and exclusive content, and I will look forward to seeing you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.